Appreciate the opportunity to
turn on the mic, please.
I will also need to be reminded that, as I kept forgetting this morning, that when a question is asked from the audience, I have to repeat the question back into the mic. It's an unnatural act, and I can't do it, so I have to prompt it every time. Ruth wasn't absolutely sure about the full title, and it's the title of a book that I and my former Rand colleague, Rob McCoon, a psychologist out of Berkeley, are writing together. And this is the full title: Lesser Evils, Choosing Among Prohibition, Legalization, and Other Drug Control Strategies, I should say. And this comes out of about 5 years of work. The book is overdue. But we've used a lot of papers along the way that have been prompted, work that's been prompted by the emergence of a new drug policy debate in the early part of this decade. Most of the discussion that goes on a sort of day-to-day basis about drug policy is really in the context, certainly in the federal government, and even in state levels, is mostly in the context of, sorry, it's hard to read, this is hawks and these doves. Software, I give up the software there. That's prevention of harm. The basic debate that has gone on in this country has really been about the balance between what is spent on treatment and prevention, the demand side programs, and what's spent on enforcement, which is seen as a supply side program on the other hand. And the current division, as I mentioned this morning, is probably, if you take all the money that's spent in the country, about 75% enforcement, about 25% goes for the other demand side activities. And there's lots of complaints that that's sort of a wrong balance, and we should be probably more like 50-50 between the two. But for reasons which I'm happy to elaborate, but don't fit into the main presentation here, that's a fairly marginal debate about changing drug policy. And there emerged in the late 80s, rather suddenly, an interest in legalization. Legalization is sort of an old issue in American drug policy. In some sense, you include alcohol and drugs, you call it the Prohibition era. But as a really live theme in discussions about drug policy, it only emerged in the late 1980s. And it continued to get a lot of public attention, though as I will show you, not a lot of public support. And we actually were approached by a foundation and asked, could we inform the debate? Because the debate clearly was a highly polarized one, without a lot of analysis and information being produced in that debate. The central argument of the legalizers is that most of the things that we now call drug problems related to illicit drugs are not consequences of drugs themselves, but really of our laws and policies with respect to those drugs. Heroin is not a particularly dangerous drug to health. If you make heroin enormously expensive, make it so that it has to be bought illegally, with unknown purity, and sometimes with toxic dilutants, then it's a dangerous drug. And so if you're sort of adding up the harms that we now see from drugs, what you basically see is most of them look like the ones I just described with heroin. They're not the drug, they're not consequences of the drug itself, but of the policies that we've adopted. Without spoiling the action, the defense of our current policies is, you can concede that point. We suffer the harms that come from our current policies. Everyone who uses these drugs now is worse off than they would be if they used them in the legal regime. But so many fewer people use those drugs, when you add it all together, they're better off. But that's a credit. And that is, I think, the sort of basic argument of the legal license. And what we wanted to do in our research was to try to inform the debate. This is not a paper, a presentation, or a book that's going to end up, here is what we should do. is much more about what can we reasonably say would be the consequences of changing our drug policy. So what we tried to do was see if we could, from the existing empirical literature and doing some additional analysis with existing data, talk about what are the effects of drug laws as they now exist, the prohibitions. Then we spent a good deal of our effort on trying to see what we could learn from the experiences of other countries which may have tried legalization or reputed to have tried legalization, from other times. What do we learn from the experience when cocaine was legal at the turn of the century, and from other vices? I mean, we flipped between prohibition and legalization for alcohol and for gambling, at least many forms of gambling. What can we learn from those experiences? And then we went to a conceptual issue, which is, for us, really as interesting as any others, which is, how should you go about assessing these alternative regimes? Assume you could project the consequences. Presume you knew what legalization accomplished. How would you assess whether we were better off or worse off? And that turns out to be a very complex and interesting question, and a reminder that there's not going to be a simple answer. That is, we are all better off with one regime or the other. Now, I'm going to be slightly laborious at the beginning, actually tell you something about the research that we did. Normally I don't present this, but this is an academic audience, and to some extent I'd like to put this up so that at some stage you may want to ask me questions about aspects of this that I don't refer to in the main presentation. One of the things that Rob did was look at the what is actually in the essays that have appeared in editorial pages and in op-ed pages arguing for or against legalization. And we did that over he did that over a 20-year period, which he's updating to cover the early 90s. He also did an interesting analysis of the effects of drug laws, which I'll talk about briefly. Then we looked at the experiences with other drugs and substances, and I guess I've actually talked about each of those. And what I'm going to do now is discuss the role of analogies and why analogies are a centerpiece in the discussion, legalization discussion, and then go on to these other topics. By the way, I'm happy to get questions along the way, preferably questions of clarification and sort of questions of debate we might leave to later. Now, one of the ways you might sort of ask about sort of how we would project the effects of legalization is to sort of ask, well, what can we learn from an analysis of drug enforcement that would tell us about what happened if we remove these prohibitions? The trouble is that what we can look at in the traditional criminal justice research paradigm is effective variations in the level of enforcement. The probability of being imprisoned for marijuana possession varies across states, but it varies between negligible and trivial. And so you don't learn a lot from that range of variation. More in general, when we talk about something as large scale as the removal of a whole regime, not simply tinkering with some law or some sentencing provision, but something that changes the whole presentation and understanding of the use of these drugs, then the existing, the standard empirical research paradigm for criminal justice is simply not going to help us. Nor can we conduct experiments. I mean, clearly, lots of the trend. I come from a department headed by Larry Sherman, probably the leading experimental criminologist. So experiments are high on the list of things that I think about doing. And you can conceive of a legalization experiment, but it's very hard to think that it would be a credible one. My best example is, the problem is, if you legalized in some jurisdiction within the U.S., it would be very difficult to keep other people out. And so you would end up having an extraordinarily complex piece of analysis to do if you could find any jurisdiction that was willing to be the experimental site. But you might say, well, look, there's Greenland. Small, isolated place. No one's going to move to Greenland just because they can get cocaine legally in Greenland. And maybe we'll pay Greenland enough money so they're willing to be the experimental site. We'll give them, everybody gets $10,000 for agreeing to participate in this experiment. And let's say we did that. Would we believe that we could extrapolate from the experience of Greenland if it changed its laws? I suggest to you the answer is clearly no. Even if Greenland was willing to do this, we would not, in fact, think it was a particularly credible experiment. And one of the papers, we sort of go through various experimental regimes and suggest why it's either not feasible politically or credible substantially. That's why so much of the discussion is built around analogies. You make projections about the effects of legalization by looking at the experience with alcohol prohibition. Now, my colleague, Rob, is much better with PowerPoint than I am, and I really love this, which merely says, yes, it fits in that one. I thought it was a nice way of presenting that. But when people talk about, well, what would happen if we had legalization, if we legalized heroin or cocaine, one of the things they do is refer to the experience with alcohol prohibition. After all, we've had an experiment. It was indeed called at that stage the Great Experiment. And as a nation, the experiment was seen to be a failure and was rejected. Actually, a questionable judgment, which I'd be happy to talk about at some stage. And what we've tried to present here is the dimensions that make an analogy more relevant. Obviously, we would like to have analogies which refer to clear legal changes, not some change in the implementation of an existing law. We'd like to have a change that involved specifically psychoactive drugs. We'd like it to be in the USA because we're uncomfortable making projections from foreign societies at the national level. And we'd like it to be recent because history makes a difference. We are a different society from the society of the 1920s in lots of important dimensions. Well, how does alcohol prohibition do on that? Well, the answer is it certainly involves legal change. It was in the US. It was not recent. And it's true it involves a psychoactive drug, but not all psychoactive drugs are alike. And you can make lots of arguments about why, even if it were a recent event, you'd still have some question about how you would project from the use of a psychoactive substance which has been socially integrated into life for a long time as compared to substances which would be relatively new to a large portion of the population. Similarly, there's reference to the experience when cocaine was legal back at the turn of the century. There were no prohibitions between about 1885 when cocaine was introduced in this country and by sort of around 1910 when most states started to move to prohibitions, finally at the federal level in the Harrison Act. And it would seem exactly right as an analogy, except society seems different now. It is not recent. Not only is it different, but in an odd way, we are now much more troubled by cocaine than they were during the legal era, because a much higher fraction of the population is cocaine dependent now. And so you'd ask, well, do we really think we can learn from what happened when there was a cocaine naive population, as there was in 1900, as compared to now when we have a cocaine experienced population out there? I won't drag you through all of these, but you can see each of these analogies is partly probative and partly flawed for these purposes of informing this debate. In particular, there's been a lot of discussion about European experiences. There's reference to, as I again mentioned this morning, Dutch coffee shops, Swiss heroin trials, etc. In truth, Europe provides no direct test on the effects of legalization because, in fact, they have very much the same regime we have legally. There's a lot of variation in their emphasis on treatment versus punishment. The Dutch are famous for their dedication to the notion that the punishment punishment should only be used to the extent, their preference is for treatment and prevention, and with incarceration as very much a last resort for even those who sell drugs at the retail level, certainly if they are themselves dependent users. At the other extreme, you have France, which is very harsh towards both drug users and drug sellers. And other countries sort of fall in between. They tend to be less harsh than us, but Sweden regularly considers the possibility of mandatory jail time for people convicted of marijuana possession offenses. In fact, they have never passed such a statute, and their sentences are probably less severe than ours. But they are much more punitive in their orientation, as is France, than our other countries. So there's a lot of variation in that, and in other aspects of treatment. Many countries have made methadone widely available for people who are heroin addicts, while others, Norway and Sweden particularly, have refused to provide methadone, thinking that that methadone is simply another opiate, and you don't want to have people dependent on opiates, whether they're legal or illegal. But remember, the references to Europe are mostly about legalization, and there simply isn't much that bears on that. They have the same prohibitions, every one of them, with respect to the selling of drugs. All of them prohibit drug sales. There's variation on with respect to prohibition of possession of drugs. In particular, two countries that don't get mentioned much, Spain and Italy, have decriminalized not simply possession of marijuana, but possession of any drug for personal use. In Spain, there was a discussion in the early 90s about whether maybe they would have criminal sanctions for using a needle in public. But that was, and in fact they didn't in the end do that. The use and possession of drugs for Spain and Italy decriminalized, and as is well known, you can get sort of, in the Netherlands, you can buy marijuana in small quantities openly at coffee shops in most major cities, in most cities. But these are a far cry from the legalization experiments that people sometimes claim is going on in Europe. I will suggest later that decriminalization is really quite a minor innovation, and the truth is that with respect to prohibition against the drugs, enforcement of prohibition concerning the drugs that we care about, Europe doesn't look so very different from us. And there are real problems, even if they made changes, in making these cross-national comparisons. Policies are by no means the only things that explain differences between these countries, and that was one of the things I talked about this morning. And there are enormous differences in the degree of informal social controls, the strength of family structures, the sense of enemy in the society, the encouragement of individualism, etc., that probably are just as important. The cause and effect between problems and policies is very unclear. For example, I would argue that most of the evidence suggests that problems cause policies rather than the other way around. What you can see is that the Europeans respond to problems by making changes in problems, by making changes in policies. It's much harder to make the case that anything they've done in policy terms has had any substantial effect on the problem of drug use itself, though some of their AIDS policies may have well reduced the seriousness of that. And there's a real problem in finding data that allow you to do these analyses. Moreover, the lessons of the analogies are very much in the eye of the beholder. I mean, there are those who say, look, the Dutch have a much more tolerant policy towards cannabis or marijuana, and they have a lower rate of cannabis use than the U.S. does. Ergo, tolerance does not increase drug use. On the other hand, Sweden, which as I said is really quite harsh with respect to marijuana, has a very much lower rate than either the Netherlands or the US. Well, that would be a suggestion that in fact, harshness, what the real comparison is within the context of Europe, which has this sort of better social support system, etc. The low figure is the Swedish figure. They're tough. You compare Sweden and the Netherlands, and toughness looks like it's it is preferable. With respect to analogies in time, you can make an argument that the problem in 1900, when cocaine was legal, is substantially less than the problem now with respect to cocaine use. Fewer people, a smaller fraction of the population used cocaine. They had a much smaller fraction of the population were dependent on cocaine, and the crime and disease related to that was much less serious than it is now. So if you compare 1900 to 1990, the argument would be, it was legally available in cocaine, it's prohibited now, things were better then, so prohibition has failed. Well, you have to be selective about the time period you use. If you went to 1950, when cocaine was prohibited, sentences were fairly tough. In fact, we had a very small cocaine problem in this country. It's not that there was some other illegal drug that was more important. For lots of reasons related to the wealth of this country, the social structure, perhaps heterogeneity of the population, we had very little use of cocaine. If you compare 1900 to 1950, it's clear that prohibition works. That is, it does indeed make the drug more expensive and fewer people use it, and the harms arguably no. Yes?
Did you say heterogeneity of the population?
Yes, at 1990, now as compared to 1950. As compared to 1900. And similarly, if you make comparisons between tobacco and alcohol, which are a much greater source of morbidity and mortality, you get the ambiguity. How much of that is a consequence of the drug itself, the conditions we've created, or the legal availability? The simple truth is that the analogies do not really allow us to make any statement about the net effect of legalization. That isn't to say that all of this is to waste, though even saying that there's not much to be learned from these analogies has a utility. What we've been focused on lately is trying to think of the right sort of analytic framework in which to fit the accumulating evidence that you might get for the purposes of making some assessment. What we suggest is that you can probably make an argument with a reasonable amount of supporting evidence that prohibition worsens the condition of those who actually use drugs. We use the term harm here. That the average harm of any session of drug use or the average harm incurred and caused by any single drug user is greater with prohibition. But the prohibition reduces use, like legalization increases use. And that the way to think about these various regimes is to talk at the broadest level about total harm, which is the product of the average harm per user and the total number of users, or the total number of use episodes. And we can say that legalization will reduce the average harm and increase the total use, and we're left with a great ambiguity about what the net effect is likely to be. And we see nothing that's likely to sort of greatly reduce that uncertainty and ambiguity in the near future. But if that's the case, then we have to say that in terms of the debate, the burden of proof is really on the legalizers. We start with a population which is convinced that even decriminalizing marijuana, which is the smallest possible legal change that one can think of, that would make a difference here, even that change is for the vast majority of the population seen as undesirable. These are figures from I think from the Gallup survey for the adults and from the National Household Survey for the younger groups. These are figures on the percentage who report that they are opposed to, I believe it's, actually I may be wrong, this may be marijuana legalization, but I think it's decriminalization. And the figure wouldn't look much different for the other one in either case. That they must make, the case rests, that they have to make an affirmative case to change the public attitude. If we look at this sort of smaller of steps, legalizing marijuana. Sorry, this is slightly out of order. Legalizing marijuana. We'd suggest that though it's less risky than the larger legalization that's mostly discussed, which would involve cocaine, heroin, etc., even so, it does have significant risks associated with it. The use of marijuana is certainly less harmful than cocaine and heroin in terms of the morbidity and mortality related to it, let alone crime, which is obviously determined by very much by the legal regime. And indeed, one advantage of legalizing marijuana is that there are bits of evidence that suggest that marijuana is a substitute for alcohol for young males. And anything that's likely to reduce heavy drinking by young males sounds like it's health enhancing. And if the trade-off is more marijuana and less heavy alcohol use, we probably are better off with that of itself. On the other hand, it's not a harmless drug in at least two senses. First of all, marijuana intoxication has some of the motor control impairment problems that you get with alcohol as well. And secondly, it is dependence creating. Marijuana is seen usually as a drug that does not lead to addiction. If the data strongly argue against that about the same fraction of people who use marijuana occasionally become dependent on it, as is true for alcohol, something like 10 to 15%, possibly higher. But that dependence is obviously much less serious in terms of the adverse consequences to the user or to others. But dependence, if marijuana became substantially more available, in particular to people as adults, the projection a reasonable projection would be that there would be a substantial increase in the number of people who are marijuana dependent, and dependence of itself, dependence in particular on a psychoactive drug, is clearly something about which we may have concern. The Dutch, who have effectively legalized marijuana, have done it in the way that seems to sort of be least problematic. That is, the Dutch have a law which prohibits marijuana and imposes criminal sanctions. They have a regulation that overrides the law, which says no prosecutor may in fact seek criminal sanction simply for the possession of small amounts of marijuana. It's a very Dutch solution. It means that the law makes them in compliance with the international treaties that they've signed. The regulation means that they're not in fact enforcing the law. Now, that just sounds like a cute way of dealing with the problem. In fact, what's striking about it is that they're very careful, and that enables them to very carefully regulate access and promotion. It is, the coffee shops cannot advertise. No producer of marijuana can advertise. The coffee shops may put up a simple symbol which says that marijuana is available here, but they may do nothing else to promote the sale of marijuana. The consequence of that is that they avoid many of the problems that would be that you might associate with marijuana legalization in this country. And evidence of, which I will get to, and the evidence of their success is that the rates have remained reasonably low by European standards. They're about the same as their neighboring countries. And there's nothing to suggest that it's become more of a gateway, that is, a higher fraction of marijuana users in the Netherlands go on to use more dangerous drugs. A lot depends, we argue, on what are the agents of legal access. I mean, if you look at, tobacco and alcohol are clearly dangerous drugs, dangerous to the users. The evidence is much stronger there, certainly, than for marijuana. And there's no safe level of use of tobacco. There's safe, indeed, health-promoting levels of use for alcohol. But we have allowed almost, until recently, almost unbridled promotion of these goods. We've had restrictions on television advertisements of tobacco, which the tobacco industry was perfectly happy with and agreed to back in 1970 in exchange for then not having television ads, public announcement messages against tobacco, which were on the television in the late 1960s. But we have allowed these industries to promote the sale and use of their drugs, even though we know them to be unsafe, and though the high initiation rates amongst adolescents represent enormously serious health threat later. With casinos, where we have credible but not overwhelming evidence that there is a problem of heavy dependent gambling, we have allowed essentially unbridled, unregulated promotion, and the states, which run the lottery business, used to be illegal. States run the lottery business, again knowing that lotteries are played disproportionately by poor people, and that for the poor it has become for non-trivial fraction of the poor, it has become a substantial part of their total expenditures, that the states have aggressively promoted the states. What I'm making is a sort of standard political economy argument that when you think about legalization of illicit drugs, what you have to realize is that you create economic interests which can affect the regulation. We may be able to come up with some optimal regulatory scheme that would suggest that we could legalize cocaine and heroin and be better off, but the question we must ask ourselves is whether, in the context of a country which is so dedicated to the First Amendment and its extraordinarily broad interpretation, and which allows commerce which is reluctant to interfere in the conduct of business, except as it affects very narrowly defined safety, that we have to pay attention to the fact that it might turn out to be extremely difficult to impose that effective regulatory scheme once we've created that industry. Now, the notion of legalizing with the agents of access being doctors or pharmacists has some credible historical foundation. When cocaine was legally available, it was legally available through doctors and initially, and then directly from pharmacists, and there wasn't a great deal of there was some promotion, but certainly nothing of the scale now associated with alcohol and tobacco. The British, who allowed and still allow doctors to maintain heroin addicts on heroin, again have not seen any effort to stimulate the demand related to heroin. And of course methadone is another one where you provide an addictive opiate, again without allowing for the stimulation of that demand. So in thinking about legalization, one of the things that one needs to think through is, one of the aspects that needs to be thought through is the extent to which one allows this to be incorporated into American commerce, where it seems to us the argument that the evidence suggests it would be very difficult to obtain effective regulation. The extent to which one could do it through a medical system, which would lead to control of promotion, but on the other hand puts doctors in a position of dispensing drugs not for the benefit of the individual, but for the protection of society from worse ills. In light of our belief that there is no basis for making credible projections about the effects of legalization, the question is whether there are other regimes different from our current very harsh prohibitionist policies that might improve the situation in the U.S. You can think of there being a variety of models that go from the system we have now, pure prohibition, harshly enforced, through to various forms of legalization, this being some being more medical, some being more commercial. And in thinking about these, we suggest that you want to focus as at least one of the principal criteria on what is called in the drug policy world harm reduction. Harm reduction is simply the notion that the goal of policy is to reduce the adverse consequences of drugs. One of those adverse consequences is the use of drugs themselves, psychoactive drugs. But that's only one of the harms. There may well be a trade-off between use and other kinds of harms. In the U.S. currently, policies are directed simply at reduction in use. If you look at the goals of the National Drug Control Strategy, they are predominantly, originally they were solely, about reducing the extent of use. And the belief was that you need to reduce this because it's wrong, but you can give it a pragmatic version, which is that if we reduce the extent of drug use in society, we'll reduce the harms related to that. So it could be that our current policies are harm reductionist. But in fact, there are some programs that can directly target harms, not all of which will reduce use. We talk about needle exchange. That may reduce the harms related to drugs. On the other hand, it could turn out to promote the use of drugs, in particular of heroin in society. Methadone maintenance is a curious one. Methadone is actually, by a number of standards, more addictive than heroin. That is, it's harder. Methadone patients have more difficulty giving up methadone than untreated heroin users have giving up heroin. Hard to control for everything, but the judgment that the methadone is more dependent. But on the other hand, you can say, well, if they're dependent on a drug which leads them to have more control of their behavior, involves them less in crime, that even though we may be promoting drug use, we're reducing the harm associated with drugs. And then you have more controversial programs, like safe use information programs that try to persuade people that if they're going to use heroin, they should snort it rather than inject it. If they're going to inject it, they should get clean needles, etc. All of which are seen by federal and other governments here as being about promoting use, but clearly are intended directly to target the adverse consequences of drug use. And you can think of the experience in Switzerland, where they allowed the open sale and purchase of drugs in a park as being sort of creating a zone of tolerance, so to reduce the amount of crime that goes around drug distribution. These are programs that aim directly to target harms, and so they may have some consequence for increasing use, but they may in the end reduce total harm. Now, what we've tried to display here is that in the US, the notion is what you want to do is reduce total use, and that'll reduce total harm. The Europeans, when they talk about harm reduction, tend to focus on what does the policy do to users, and they're satisfied in simply finding that the harm to the users and the users' con to others is reduced. They rarely then go to the next step and ask, well, but does it promote use and get us to reducing total harm? We believe that change in this country is only going to come when one moves towards a paradigm in which there's an attention to harm, but at the same time, one of the harms that's listed is use, so that we don't fail to include use in the adverse consequences that we direct policy to deal with, but we don't let that dominate. I had said I would talk for about 45 minutes and leave the rest of the time for questions. Let me sort of just summarize what we think we have learned and hope that provides a sort of platform for questions. With respect to legalization itself, just argue that the net effects for society as a whole, and even more for society as a whole, are really not predictable. There's also a complicated trade-off amongst competing interests. Incredibly make an argument that for inner city communities, legalization would substantially reduce the harms that they suffer from drug use. Enormously high rates of drug use now. They suffer the consequences of the violence and corruption around drug markets. Those harms could be dramatically reduced by legalization, and one can reasonably argue that the increase in drug use that results in those communities themselves would be fairly modest. On the other hand, take middle-class parents like myself, whose principal interest, concern about drugs is whether my son is going to get involved with drugs. I am worsened. My situation is worsened by legalization. The probability that my son will become a dependent drug user almost certainly goes up under the with any legalization regime. There are conflicting interests here, and whatever is the aggregate answer as to whether it's harm reducing, even that doesn't end the debate, because then there are these competing interests. Do we care mostly about, should we give particular weight to the concerns of those who are most disadvantaged in our society now? Decriminalization, which is what we've seen in Spain and Italy, and with respect to marijuana in a number of states in this country, seems to make very modest changes in drug use. The standard result, the finding with respect to decriminalization of marijuana here, decriminalization simply meaning removal of criminal penalties for the possession of a drug. If you look at Spain and Italy, they're not very different from their neighbors in Europe, which is not a strong basis for a conclusion. They don't look very different. If you look at the US, it's very hard to tell decriminalization states from states that didn't decriminalize in terms of the prevalence of marijuana use. On the other hand, the gains from decriminalization look quite limited as well. Certainly it makes drug policy less intrusive. A lot of people are then not subject to being arrested. But if you ask what are the great harms that trouble American society about drugs, it's not so much the intrusiveness, though I might weight that highly, but as the crime and health consequences, neither of which are dealt with by decriminalization. The illegal markets still exist. All you've done is, in some sense, stimulate demand. And to that extent, there are other harms that are worsened by decriminalization. Harm reduction still seems to us an important insight, but in the context of the US, it'll have to be somehow integrated with the more moralistic concerns that are summarized by use reduction. So, let me return to the title, Lesser Evils. One is choosing here among regimes characterized by the following. We don't know what their consequences are,
and we don't know how to weigh those consequences. We are choosing amongst evils, and we will choose that which we think in aggregate is a lesser evil, but that's the best that we can do. Thank you. I'll be happy to take questions. Yes?
I was interested in your legalization point there. I'm surprised that in the area of use, huffing of legalized products is already legalized.
Sorry, say that again?
Huffing of legalized products, we already have legalization.
Yeah, I mean,
We don't have illegal paints, thinners, and so
I-
a very large area of increase in use is in the huffing area. Those items are already legalized.
in the huffing, do you use the
Huffing.
huffing?
That's sniffing paints and aerosols.
I say I've not heard the term huffing before. Okay, fine. No, I understand. Solvent and inhalant use are in fact a sort of universal problem. It's not peculiarly American. I mean, I read papers about glue sniffing in Scotland and in solvents in Brazil. And if you're talking about the 12 to 15-year-old crowd, it's clear that that is a very serious problem. And it's a problem which is clearly unrelated to what we formally think of as drug policy, because these are legal products that have a use which is unchallenged for its legitimacy in society. We can think about ways of regulating it to minimize the risks that they offer through inhaling or sniffing. You can change the composition of substances in a way that makes them less attractive. There can be packaging. You might require that it be in a form that doesn't allow. I mean, we used to have, I think that the regulation of methylated spirits, the form was changed so that it was no longer a sort of alternative to buying to buying taxed and legal alcohol. But there are limits to what one can do around that. But it's also interesting that those are important sources of health and probably behavioral harms for young adolescents. They lose their appeal by the late teens. They're not attractive highs and are replaced by a variety of others. I don't know if that answers your question.
It just seems to be a never-ending source of finding something how.
Well, clearly a discussion of legalization starts with the presumption that there is a demand for psychoactive experiences of ingesting psychoactive substances. And as you know, sort of, except for the Eskimos who never had access to anything that would allow them to get intoxicated, every society has found some form of intoxication. And if you were thinking about starting society over again, if we were starting over again and we were making choices among psychoactives as to which to prohibit and which to make legal, it is almost certain that doing this in an objective way with respect to harms and pleasures, we would prohibit alcohol and we would legalize marijuana. But of course, that isn't the choice that's in front of us. We have a population which has become accustomed to access to alcohol, which is unwilling to accept great restriction on that access. If you make marijuana available, maybe it will reduce alcohol use, but obviously you have to be concerned that it simply extended the range and attractiveness of psychoactive substances that are available to this society. So the whole legalization discussion is really premised on the assumption that there will be ingestion of psychoactive substances, that people seek intoxication, and there are lots of bases for that. And what we're trying to do is find the optimal way of regulating their availability. And the current regime has made its choice. I think there was someone here, I thought.
No, I was just going to say that as far as the solvents, I mean, nutmeg is a psychedelic. There's all kinds of things.
Yeah, we do not. I mean, there are. Sorry, I really failed to pick up on what I think is the analytically important point that you raised. I I mean, there is an enormous range of substances that give people the experience of intoxication. The quality of that experience is very varied across those substances. I mean, some, I would say, are unambiguously better than others. But some are simply different. There's a surprising degree of drug loyalty amongst those who use. For example, when heroin became substantially less available in the mid-1970s, the U.S. got lucky. There were droughts in all the heroin-producing, opium-producing places. They cut the French Connection. The French Connection case really reduced the capacity to distribute, to import heroin for a while. There was a period in which the price of heroin went up substantially, and there was a lot less heroin use. And I looked at data that I thought was pertinent to how much use expanded, how much use of other opiates who provide for most people very similar experiences. How much use of other opiates went up? The answer was just a very small amount. And what police reported in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when heroin prices went down and became more available again, was that a lot of people who had not been involved with drugs, they had old track marks, no evidence of use of other drugs over the last 3 or 4 years, were suddenly back using heroin. And that was sort of, there are 2 or 3 other experiences like that with respect to Quaaludes, for example, where there are things that look like substitutes. For someone like me who is not a user of these substances, I don't know why you particularly prefer this one over the other. The preferences seem to be quite strong amongst those who are dependent users. Doesn't mean that heroin users don't try lots of other things, but it is a reminder that the differentiation amongst substances is really quite important to users, and that if we add to the variety of things that are available, some people may find those things particularly attractive and become dependent who were not dependent, were not attracted by the other things that were available previously. Yes?
Will you consider what happened in California, a significant breakthrough in the legalization of drugs, and are other states bound to follow the California model?
No, sorry. The question was whether California is sort of a bellwether on this, as it is on bellwether with respect to marijuana legalization, as it is on so many other issues. California is a state which has, with respect to marijuana, let me do this in a couple of stages. Historically, California was one of the leading states for the decriminalization of marijuana in the 1970s. It had quite a high felony arrest rate for marijuana in the early 70s, decriminalized, and the rates fell substantially. I don't know the survey data, but my belief is that the California population has been more liberal towards marijuana as measured by reactions to the percentage who support marijuana decriminalization than other states. It's clear that marijuana. I mean, if you look at the AIDS activists, that in California, access to marijuana for dealing with the AIDS wasting syndrome has been a much more central issue in California than in other states. The buyers' clubs are very strong in San Francisco. I think much stronger there than anywhere else in the country. There are a number of indicators I would suggest that California was more predisposed towards this than other states, and also the marijuana reform activists were better organized there. They sold this to the public on the grounds that there was a reasonable basis for believing that marijuana had medical uses. And half of those who voted in favor of it, according to some survey data, voted simply because they were for making this available for medical purposes, did not want to see relaxation of marijuana laws generally, and half of those who voted for it were in favor of marijuana reform. It passed with, I think, 55%, maybe it was a little higher, of the vote. So even in California, you were only talking about less than a third, a little more than a quarter of the electorate who were really pushing for marijuana legalization reform, legal reform. And the issue about marijuana as medicine is one which is potentially resolvable by research. I was saying to the students at lunchtime, there's very little research about therapeutic uses of marijuana. And I, until a couple of years ago, had assumed that this was essentially because the federal government was opposed to undertaking such research, seeing it as denting the sort of firm image that marijuana was a dangerous drug. In fact, what I encountered was, in some effort to sort of get through an organization a recommendation to promote the research on marijuana as medicine, was that biomedical scientists themselves are very uninterested in examining the possibility that marijuana is therapeutic, whole marijuana. I mean, biomedical researchers make their living by developing new drugs and by science. And here you have a naturally occurring weed, which somebody says, if you smoke it, will be good medicine. There is nothing else in the pharmacopoeia that you ingest that way. And there are lots of scientific arguments about the bioavailability that way is uncontrolled. You don't know about dosages, lots of things. They don't like this as a mode of delivering something which no pharmaceutical company has any interest in developing either. So there's sort of about 4 counts against doing research on marijuana, not least of which is your peers won't be very interested in the results. So there's been a lot of reluctance to do research about the marijuana as medicine. And of course what that does is promote popular belief. When the government is sort of appearing to not fund this, to be suppressing this research, and there'll be occasional stories consistent with that promotes the popular belief that it probably is medicine. I mean, there's credible stories, but not, there's enough to make testing, to make research plausible, but not to make the case strongly. That if the government now undertakes research, that I believe will probably establish that there's some version of marijuana not smoked which will turn out to have therapeutic uses, that will in effect isolate the medical marijuana issue from the issue of marijuana policy generally. I mean, I have no view about marijuana as medicine. I have a view that research should be done about it simply because the belief is so important. But I don't care for the Proposition 215 because it merges these two issues. It makes marijuana available under rather murky circumstances on the claim that it has medical value. And as analysts do, I would like clarity. I would like to have it dealt with as medicine and then dealt with as a recreational drug and keep those separate because they are in fact separate issues. Yes?
I'm not sure I understood. You made the distinction between taking it orally or some other way besides smoking it.
Well,
I thought that the reason
yes.
that they smoked it was because they can't take anything orally because nausea.
No, I mean that's why
smoking is effective.
right. The marijuana at the moment is the active ingredient of marijuana, the tetrahydrocannabinol, is available in a tablet form. The tablet is called Marinol, which requires that you swallow it, of course. It's also rather expensive, in fact, very expensive. There are patients who can smoke marijuana but find the ingestion of Marinol difficult. There are doctors, by the way, who do not believe that, who simply argue that patients have this perception that, in fact, the problem isn't that serious. But those aren't the only two ways of delivering THC. And it may be that there's an inhalant version, or it may be that you take it through water pipes. One of the issues is smoking marijuana is carcinogenic. Anytime you take smoke into your lungs, there are risks to the lung coverings themselves. Through the water pipe, you can take out most of the carcinogens. Well, that is the claim. It's not clear if that's true, but there are lots of ways of thinking about the delivery of the therapeutic ingredients that don't require smoking or a tablet. And we're just in the early stages of doing research about this. No one knows what, in fact, are the active ingredients that make it therapeutic, and what it is you want to keep and what you want to get out, and what's the optimal way of delivering it.
What you mean by water pipe, like a bong?
Like a bong, absolutely.
Well, I mean, that would be, you'd still have to, I mean, you could still grow it in your house and smoke through a bong and get the same benefit and not have to pay the outrageous price for the...
No, sorry. I mean, yes, but now there's a market for bongs, and that would give somebody a commercial interest in the matter. Sorry. Right. For... no, they are, in fact, I mean, head shops that specialize in the sale of paraphernalia are prohibited under federal statute.
How do they do it? It's widespread.
Not every law is well enforced. I mean, I'm shocked to discover gambling is going on. I don't, but in fact, this is not an issue of bong. I actually think that the prohibition is on stores that specialize. I'm not sure that there's a prohibition on bongs themselves. The water pipe is probably canard in this, sort of not the relevant thing. But there are other modes of delivering active ingredients, inhalants, for example, that may get you by without doing that. Yes.
A lot of the discussion that we had in the morning and the lunch and the afternoon, we focused on the addiction aspect. What are the effects on numbers of addicts and the severity of addiction before those addicts? On the policies that we have. Of course, criminal justice, we also focus on the other aspects of crime, including associated gangs or violence, weapons, all the departments that go with drugs and addiction to drugs. Given your background in economics, I've heard the theory posed that even if twice as many addicts come out of the change in legalization.
Yep. Okay.
If we remove the economic
Sure.
stimulus when we take away all the profits, if we make it dirt cheap to buy the drugs, we eliminate the possibility of these huge gangs and violence, and therefore your model of total harm might be reduced even if more addicts are created.
Okay. Look, let me repeat the question so we have it here. I mean, no. I now want to respond. Not too great a length, but it's a very good question. Question was, given that I've talked mostly about the health harms related to drugs, clearly there are very serious criminal harms. It may well be that we could take substantial increases in addiction and still be better off with their consequent adverse health consequences, and still be better off because we have greatly reduced crime. And let me see if I can, this gives me a chance to present just a little bit of extra data. One of the discussions that often goes on is, why do we pay so much attention to illegal drugs, given that when we talk about the health consequences of illegal drugs pale in comparison to that associated with the two legal drugs, alcohol and tobacco. And these are sort of standard figures, 100,000 deaths from alcohol, 400,000 tobacco, and you put all the drugs together, you could probably get it up to 20,000, but that takes some work. It's probably more like 10 or 15. And I often use that as a sort of gateway into the drug problem is not measured by some single. There's no single measure of the drug problem. What we care about are a whole range of things, from adolescents dropping out of school early because they get involved with marijuana, through the creation of large criminal incomes that maybe attract people into drug selling rather than into legitimate pursuits, through the distortion in U.S. Foreign policy as a result. And you're absolutely right. We may well be willing to give up, to take a large increase in the health consequences of psychoactive use in order to get a reduction in crime and particularly in criminal incomes. When I say reduction in crime, I rarely actually will confront an audience with that trade-off because I think there's an enormous discomfort with conceiving of that. And the standard policy belief is that if we are tough enough about drugs, we will reduce drug use, and when we reduce drug use, everything else, all the harms associated with drug use will decline. The principal insight of the harm reduction movement is that you may trade off one set of harms against another through a particular program. In particular, there are things that may increase drug use but reduce drug harms. And at the most global level, you're absolutely right. Legalization, if you ask me, putting aside what all the caveats I have about the basis for making projections, what would be the likely consequence of legalization of cocaine? We don't have to take every drug together, which is one of the weaknesses of the current debate. I would believe that the use of cocaine would increase substantially, not tenfold, but it'd be double, triple, something like that. No particular basis for that, but that would be my best guess about that. And addiction would go up at least as much, if not more, and the adverse health consequences would go up less than that, but still substantially. And still, I would suggest that the reduction in the harms borne by others in the form of crime, many different avenues connecting, different paths connecting drugs and crime currently, that reduction would overwhelm any worsening of our health situation. And that's not a comfortable trade-off to think about. And I have said what is my best guess, and having spent probably more time at trying to go at this analytically and empirically than anybody else, I think it's probably the best guess around, and it's only a guess. And if someone said, no, it's going to be 10 times, or no, it's only going to be 50%, I've got to say, you could be right. I don't have much basis for this. Anything I do has enormous uncertainty around it. But yes, the heart, I would say, of this, when everyone gets in the room and throws off their ideological blinkers and says, what do we think is going to happen here? I think we are trading health against crime. Now, one of the great efforts is to convert crime into a health problem. But that's only going to go so far. Crime is more than just a health problem. It certainly has health consequences. But that's a very, very hard choice for people to have to deal with. In some ways, I've enabled them not to deal with it, but I said you can't make any projections, so we don't have to get to that stage. But Tim.
Do you detect any improvement in the quality or the rigor of the debate, either in Washington or elsewhere, about these trade-offs, or is it still driven primarily by ideological?
look, I have a tendency to pessimism, so do a little discounting of this, but I see no sign of any improvement in this respect. Indeed, I would say there's a worsening, and curiously enough, the legalizers have some responsibility for that. And I mean, that's not blaming them, but if you ask why have things worsened, I think it is the continued prominence of the legalizers in the sense that senior federal officials certainly always feel impelled to make strong statements about the dangers of legalization, and that, I think, further hardens their view about the importance of not making any changes that look as though they're denying the seriousness of drugs in this society. And I mentioned this morning a comment by Secretary Shalala. Donna Shalala is sort of before she became Secretary of HHS, was regarded as a liberal, certainly interested in programs that interventions by the government to help the poor, which is sort of one of the classic tests of liberals. Drug policy was not something which she was particularly interested in. But in the job that she's had now, where she's had to deal with, for example, the Surgeon General, Joycelyn Elders, who said something that was perfectly sensible, namely, maybe we should sort of study legalization. I actually think she's wrong because we won't learn all that much from the study. I've sort of been involved in that. I'm going to tell you, you heard me give all the qualifications, so I don't think she was quite right, but it was probably a sensible thing to say. And the Clinton White House, which takes 17 months to decide whether to blow its nose, in 3 hours, had a written response disowning Joycelyn Elders. I mean, it is a live wire. I don't think she realized it when she picked it up, but I think that really has helped harden the rhetoric. General McCaffrey has made some changes in the rhetoric. He is against the use of the war analogy. He wants to use one which I think is not very good, which is cancer and developing a cure. But he does, but except for sort of, I'd say, really marginal rhetorical changes by him, I see nothing to suggest anything other than continued harshness. Can I actually expand on this for a couple of minutes? And this is very Washington people particularly interested in this kind of question. In Congress, there is nobody who has made drug policy change a major issue for himself or herself. With lots of issues, you can identify a member of Congress who's decided that public housing is his or her issue and will do something to push programs of that kind or fight for change in civil rights legislation, something like that. The drug reform, policy reform groups can find nobody, and I'm not just talking here about legalizers, but people who simply want to see, for example, needle exchange promoted or some modification of the penalties for crack. Are unable to find any member of Congress who is really willing to engage in the long run, sort of for more than standing up for a speech, in dealing with this issue. I think there's an enormous pessimism amongst liberals that there is anything to be done, and that's somewhat self-fulfilling. Nobody pushes very hard. Again, as I said this morning, the changes in criminal statutes just seem to me very threatening. When a relatively liberal state like Maryland starts talking about a maximum prison term of 4 years for a second conviction on marijuana possession, I think we are indeed and that gets no attention. We are indeed in parlous times.